here in Lesson 4, we're going to finish up talking about the disapproval of war. Then we're going to get into a couple of ways in which early Christians seem to accept war. And maybe not participation in it, but they knew war was a thing, and they talked about it, and they made references to it, and being a good soldier, things like that. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So let's continue this idea of the treatment of enemies and wrongdoers. All right, we're talking about the idea of not just defending yourself, right? But can we defend other people, right? Should we use violence to protect other people? Now, somebody might say, well, I saw somebody over there getting attacked, so I need to do something about it, right? Okay. But what about those things you can't see, right? There's people out there getting hurt all over the place, right? You can't see it. But if violence was the way to fight against evil, then shouldn't we just be roaming around all the time, destroying evil, right? Like a video game, it's our quest. We're going to go and defeat the evil, right? It's out there, all over the place. What are we doing, right? Well, but nobody seriously thinks that we're supposed to be doing that, right? Now you might say, well, that's the job of the police, and maybe you want to do that, okay. But their job isn't to go out and destroy evil, right? But if it's good to do that, then that's something we should do, right? But that seems a little different. We might be concerned somebody close to us, or so we see somebody, but once you get around the corner, that's not my business, right? Evil is all around us. And the fact is, violence is not the best solution. There are a lot better ways to deal with sin. The Christian life, Christian teaching, the Christian example is a much better method of controlling wrongdoing than physical force. Right? I'm sure you know some guys that are maybe kind of rough. And if you're a good Christian person, they might have a lot of respect for you. I think about those mob movies, mafia movies or something, where they're at a wake. There's all these guys are cold hard killers, right? But when the priest walks in or the reverend walks in, they're very respected to him, right? Because he's a man of the cloth. He's immune. They recognize that that's not a Christian's duty, right? But what separates that priest from one of us, right? Now we think about those days, the Christians suffered terrible things at the hands of their persecutors for hundreds of years. You think their suffering would have been less if from the very beginning Christian knights had been roaming around using force and bloodshed to defend the other Christians? Right? I don't think so. Again, we talked about the Apostle Paul. What if somebody had been lying in wait? I heard Paul's coming to Damascus. We're going to ambush him on the road. No, that's not what God had in mind, right? God had in mind to use him, even in all his wickedness. And he didn't deserve that. But God's grace transformed him into one of the most powerful missionaries in church history. Right? And who was it that was trying to kill him? Well, the Jews were actually laying in wait, trying to kill him later. Right? But not the Christians. Or there's a very sad story. There was a woman named Sabina. She was actually sentenced to the brothel. This was something that the Romans did, part of their persecution. They knew that Christian women were very moral and upright, so they would throw them into slavery and prostitution if they wouldn't recant of Christianity. And so, you know what? Nobody went to save her. But she had a response to the judge that sentenced her. She said, the holy God will see about that. Right? She entrusted it to God. Some people say, well, if you're not going to fight, you're a coward. But cowards could have never endured torture like that. Right? You're not going to say, okay, I'm not going to fight you. even if you're going to tie me down and pour boiling oil from my feet all the way up to my head, that's not cowardly, right? Saying, I'm not going to fight. I'll go stand in the front line, but I'm not going to hold a sword. I'll stand between your army and theirs. You can kill me if you want, but I'm not going to kill anybody else. The only explanation that makes sense is that these people were devoted to following the teachings of their master. And in doing that, they were changing the world. They were doing more good than anybody ever has since then. Now, what else could we say? Why did Christians disapprove of war? Well, they experienced a lot of evil in the character of soldiers. Right? We look at John the Baptist, Jesus, James, Peter, Paul. They were all abused and killed by soldiers. Right? That's not great. We start with Nero in 64 AD. Christians were officially persecuted by the Roman government. Right? It was the official act of the Roman government to persecute these guys. And that didn't really stop. It laid off from time to time, and it was more localized in some places. But for the next 250 years, Christians were persecuted. And soldiers, you see here, were the Roman police. And that meant they were responsible for torturing and executing any Christian that was brought up on charges against the empire. Right? And it was illegal to worship Christ. Right? It was a new religion. You weren't allowed to make up new religions. And they made up all sorts of stuff about Christians. They burned them at the stake. They put them on the rack. They covered them in boiling oil. They got beaten, flogged, crucified, beheaded. Were they fighting back? We don't have any evidence of them fighting back for hundreds of years. Churches were getting destroyed. The Praetorian Guard would come in with axes and weapons of iron, breaking things apart. We go to Phrygia. There was a whole town that happened to be Christian. And the Romans, they burned the whole town because it was a Christian town. And they wouldn't stop being Christian. Did they fight off the guards? No, they didn't. And they refused to participate in war. Right? All the evidence that we see up to this point leads us to believe they would refuse. Right? But if we think about what we have in the New Testament, we have guys like Cornelius, maybe a couple soldiers baptized with him. We got the Philippian jailer, his household. Right? Aside from those guys, we don't have any evidence of a single Christian soldier until AD 170. That's 140 years. Now, certainly there were some, but again, we don't have any evidence of it. But we look at AD 180, we see Tatian. He condemned war as murderous. And he was opposed to the military calling. He wrote this, I do not want to be a king. I do not wish to be rich. I decline military command. I hate fornication. Right? I don't want to do it. I don't want to have any part of that. It's murderous. We look at the heathen philosopher Celsus. Right? We talked about some Greek philosophers that became Christians. Celsus was not a Christian. He did not like the Christians. He wrote against the Christians. And what did he say? He was pleading with them. You guys, you should join the government. You should fight. You should give the emperor your strength. Fight for him. Serve as soldiers for him. Now, why is he saying that? Because the Christians aren't doing it. Right? He's saying you need to do this. And the Christians are saying, no, we don't. He argues, if everyone behaved like you guys, the empire would be left alone. Right? The emperor would be left alone. The whole country would be falling apart. The barbarians would be coming in. Right? So again, if his point is, if everybody acted like you, well, then what were you acting like? Right? They didn't participate in war. And so again, the first reliable evidence we have for Christians in the army is around the time of Marcus Aurelius, between 160 and 180 AD. That's where we first see Christians joining the army. Right? After they became Christians. And so Harnack says again, it's not therefore surprising that until the time of Marcus Aurelius, a question of military service did not exist in the churches, right? Until that time, a baptized Christian didn't become a soldier. And if you were caught by faith in the camp, right? If you're a soldier and you become a Christian, then you had to see how you could come to terms with that profession, right? Maybe you're in a pretty peaceful place, no big deal, right? You just got to avoid somehow sacrificing to Caesar, burning that incense, right? Maybe your commander will look the other way, maybe not, but you've got to make some concessions or you got to get out of the camp. You got to get out of the army because Christians didn't do that. But we find Tertullian, again, that's about 200 AD. He makes it clear there are a considerable number of Christians serving in the Roman army, right? And some people thought of it like, oh, it's good to have a banner in the enemy's camp, right? And they viewed the Roman army as the enemy, right? But if we can have a banner in their camp, we've got Christians in there, that we're going to convert the army. That's great, right? But how do you do that, right? There's still this strong unwillingness to serve in the army, right? Some people, they couldn't get out. He said, we remember one of the things Tertullian said, that Christians would go to war if it weren't for the fact that our teaching is it's more lawful to be killed than to kill, right? So since that's what we teach, we can't go to war, right? He talks about the idea of being a magistrate, right? Again, being a judge. And he says, maybe a Christian could be a judge if you could somehow avoid all the things that the judge has to do that a Christian shouldn't do. And he gives a list. He says, if you could be a judge without sacrificing, without giving your authority to the sacrifice, without contracting sacrificial victims, that's going to be like a sheep or something, not a person, but if you can avoid caring for the pagan temples, if you watch after the pagan temple's money, you shouldn't be doing that. Giving shows at your own expense or at the expense of the public, those were the big games that they did where gladiators and things were fighting. That's not a Christian thing to do. Or presiding over them when they are given. Or making a proclamation or an edict or any solemnity or even swearing oaths. See, they were very serious. Jesus said, don't swear at all, right? So then how could you be a judge and make someone swear if you're not supposed to swear? He said that doesn't make any sense. And you can't judge anyone on a capital or criminal charge, right? Because how can you order someone to be put to death, right? Maybe you could allow about money, right? Christians could decide, you actually owe him some money. You should pay him, right? But you can't condemn anyone. You can't bind anyone. You can't imprison anyone. You can't torture anyone. You're not going to make a very good judge if you can't put anybody in jail, right? He says, how will a Christian make war? Nay, how will you serve as a soldier even in peacetime without the sword that the Lord has taken away, right? If you're in the army and you don't have a sword, what are you? You're just, you're a cook or something, maybe, You could be. But he says, although soldiers had come to John and received from him a rule, and there was a centurion that believed, right? We talked about them. The guys that came to John said, what should we do? Well, don't extort anybody. Well, then the centurion came to Jesus. He believed. But the Lord afterward, in disarming Peter, ungirded every soldier. Take that belt off. Put the sword away. Yes. And shall he, who is not the avenger even of his own wrongs, administer chains and imprisonments and tortures and executions? Right? If somebody were to wrong me and I'm not going to repay them, I'm not going to seek vengeance, can I have somebody imprisoned or executed for something they did to somebody else? That doesn't seem right. He says, of course, the case is different. If the faith comes later to somebody already in the military service, all the same, though, when they accept that faith, then they either have to leave the service at once, or has been done by many, right? Many people have left the service, he said. So Tertullian knows there's a lot of Christians in the army. There are a lot of people that became Christians in the army and they got out. Right? Maybe a little harder to do in the Roman army than today. You know? Today we got a lot of volunteer armies. We got, you sign up for your whatever tour. When it's over, you can get out. He says, or one will have to make many objections, lest anything can be committed against God. Right? If you're going to stay in the army, you got to be careful. You got to make sure you don't do anything against God. It's no excuse. I'm a soldier. I got ordered to do it. No. You're a Christian soldier. You have orders from God. Right? There's this great quote, one of my favorite ones. They have no need of sinning, whose one need is that of not sinning. Right? You can't say, I have to do that. It's evil. No, your one thing that you need to do is not do evil. Right? That's the one thing that you need to do. So you can't do the opposite. Now, of course, idolatry was a big problem. Right? A lot of people that are more pro-war are going to look back at the Roman Empire and they're going to say, no, the Christians didn't want to do that because of the idolatry. That's why they didn't want to be a soldier, because you had to worship Caesar, you had to worship these different gods. And that is true. But as we've seen, quote after quote after quote, bloodshed and violence were just as bad. Now, a lot of these writers have pointed to alternative service that Christians provide. Right? Things that we do for the empire that soldiers can't do. We're not just going through our lives not being any benefit to anybody, but Christ is bringing a benefit through us, even if we're not involved in public affairs. Right? If we go to the 3rd century, 4th century, I think even the 6th century, like in the 500s, there are still church orders governing churches in different places that said if you're a soldier or you're a magistrate, you can't be immersed. You can't have communion unless you're willing to put your sword down and repent. All right? Then you can come. And if you go back to it, then you're out. Right? You're going to have to spend 5 years praying and begging and studying to get back in if you want to have communion again. They were very strict. Right? Origen argues, look, even the pagans, they don't require their priests to serve in the army or shed blood. Right? They're kept from those things so that they can offer sacrifices to their gods. Right? David wanted to build a temple. What did God say? No, you're a man of war. You're not going to build my temple. So if we are the temple of God, should we be a man of war? That doesn't make any sense. Right? We have to keep ourselves away from those things, that we don't stain our hands or our conscience with the blood of another. Origen says that Christians should do their military service as priests and servants of God. Right? You want to serve your country? Do it as a priest. Do it as a servant of God. Keep your hands pure so that you can pray to God on behalf of those who righteously serve as soldiers and of him who reigns righteously. Right? It's interesting. The guys that he's saying, look, these guys that are there, that are soldiers, that aren't Christians, they're doing what they ought to do. Right? They're following the law. They are doing these things. But they ought to become one of us. He later said, Christians benefit their countries more than do the rest of men, educating the citizens and teaching them to be devout toward the God of the state. Right? We're teaching people how to be devoted to God. He talks about just wars. Some people say, well, if you can have a just war, then we should be a part of it. No, he's saying, look, if there is going to be a war, it needs to be a just war. You don't just go fight on a whim. You don't just know rules, right? You need to have a war that's fair, that's for the right reasons, but not as a Christian. He's talking about rules for non-Christians and their wars to kind of rein them in. Origen's view of the Christian's duty in regard to war is put as clearly as words could make it. Once someone accepted Christianity, you have to put away the use of arms. It's that simple. Now, he makes this kind of justification with the wars of non-Christians, right? He says it can't be made ground either for doubting his seriousness, right? Just because he says non-Christians can fight in a war, you can't think he's not serious about it, or that he's not consistent, right? Because he has got he's thought it out a lot. We go to Lactantius. He rules out military service and capital charges. Why? Because it's homicide. It's killing a person. That's a violation of justice, right? Justice itself says, don't kill him. He says this, and so it will not be lawful for a just man to serve as a soldier. For justice itself is his military service. That's the service. We need justice. We can't accuse anyone of a capital offense because it makes no difference whether you kill with a sword or with a word, since killing itself is forbidden. And so, in this commandment of God, no exception at all ought to be made to the rule that it is always wrong to kill a man, whom God has wished to be regarded as a truly sacred creature. That's our last quote for the Christian disapproval of war. No exception at all ought to be made to the rule that it is always wrong to kill a man. That is in 310 AD. 280 years after Jesus left this earth. The church understood this very well. Now you fast forward 100 years to 411, and the Roman army is 100% Christian. No non-Christian was allowed to serve in the army. Did you know that? That's how quickly it changed from the time of Constantine. Over the next 100 years, the world flipped upside down. So, what changed? Let's talk a little bit about some ways that they did approve of war, right? And one of those is the use of military terms and phrases, right, to talk about the religious life. Think about Paul. We look at the New Testament, you're familiar with some of these things, I'm sure, these metaphors that he has. The armor of God, put on the armor of God, right? I got a breastplate and a helmet and a belt and shoes and a shield and a sword. Wow, I'm armed for battle, right? God wants me to be. But it's all a metaphor, right? Righteousness, salvation, truth, peace, faith, the Spirit. What? None of that is a weapon of war, not a physical warfare. He talks about weapons of righteousness for the right hand and the left hand. I'm going to be dual wielding here. But again, weapons of righteousness, of doing what's right. He calls men his fellow soldiers, his fellow captives. He talks about human warfare. He talks about the Christians' struggle against evil angelic powers, right? That's like, it's our battle. Right? We don't have a battle of flesh and blood, but against the powers of this age. He tells Timothy, be a good soldier of Christ. That's maybe easy to take that out of context, right? Oh, look, see, Paul says be a good soldier. And he also says those that get involved in military affairs, if you get in the military, you don't get mixed up in civilian affairs, right? Your job is to be in the army, right? But why does he use that example? To say that when you become a Christian, you don't get mixed up in non-Christian stuff, right? It's an analogy. It's not a instruction. Twice, he goes out of his way to make very clear he's not talking about earthly warfare. He says, though we walk in the flesh, we do not serve as soldiers according to the flesh. For the weapons of our military service are not those of the flesh, but powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds. We're going to be knocking down castles and stuff? No, not that kind of stronghold. Demolishing theories and every rampart thrown up against the knowledge of God, right? We're getting rid of arguments. We're battling against things that are trying to stand against the knowledge of God. It's a spiritual battle. In Ephesians, he says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world potentates of darkness, against this spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the armor of God. Right? Potentates is a funny word. But it's world leaders, kind of, these powers of the air. That's our battle. There's a lot of military language like that. And, Paul used it. And so guys are going to use it after him. Clement, all these guys moving along, even until the 3rd century, right? And it starts becoming more and more frequent, these military metaphors, especially on the Latin side, right? The Latin writers, right? Paul and them are Greek, but the Latin ones from Rome, they start really getting into these military metaphors. And it's interesting to me because we use the word pagan all the time, right? What does it mean? It means a non-Christian, right? But paganus originally meant a civilian. Somebody that's not in the army. Because like I told you, the change from 300 to 400, once we get to 411 AD, everyone serving in the army is a Christian. Non-Christians were not allowed to serve in the army at that point. And so, if you were a pagan, you couldn't be in the army, right? Because you were a civilian, right? So non-Christians were civilians. But now it means something totally different, right? Now, these metaphors, though, people started to misunderstand them, right? And as you get more and more Christians actually in the army, right? Because we know some of them were there. Soldiers were becoming Christians. You can think of a Roman soldier who became a Christian, thinking of himself as a Christian soldier. Okay, yeah, I don't want to get mixed up in other affairs. I got my armor of God, right? But remember, they didn't have their own copies of the Bible either, right? Maybe you go down to the church and maybe they have some and maybe they can read it, but a lot of these guys are just listening. Maybe they didn't listen too well. Maybe they don't go to church too often. There's more and more Christians that are coming up with their own ways of thinking about things. And so it starts changing people's minds, right? But it's interesting. We think about the wars of the Old Testament, right? This was another way that people kind of accepted things because there's a lot of wars in the Old Testament. There's a lot of violence back there. And people today will look and say, okay, look, see, that's there. We can do that. David was a warrior. We should be a warrior, right? That's okay. God allows that. But the early Christians didn't believe that, right? They knew about David. They knew about Samson. They knew about all those guys. But they didn't see any contradiction in the fact that, but that's not what we do, right? That's not what we're called to do. The scriptures were inspired. The scriptures were history. It was divinely controlled, right? The books were sacred. We can't criticize that. That's what happened. But what does it tell us? Are we supposed to follow that example? Or we follow Jesus' example? Because there's no early Christian that would assume that whatever he read in the Old Testament, he could do. Right? Now, okay, maybe some of them did. Right? But in generally, you understand, just because you read somebody did it in the past, doesn't mean I can do it now. Because you can't just say, well, it's about military stuff. David, he was a warrior, so we can be a warrior. Well, Abraham, he had concubines, right? Some of these guys, Samson, he went to the prostitute in that one town, before they tried to catch him, and he picked up the gates and carried it to the top of a hill and left it there, right? He was sleeping with a prostitute. So did Judah, So prostitution's fine, right? Because they did it in the Old Testament. You would say, no, you crazy? It's immoral. Oh, but these great heroes of faith did it. That doesn't matter, right? Paul doesn't criticize Abraham, does he? You know, the writer of Hebrews praises the faith of Rahab. But she was literally a prostitute, right? That doesn't mean that you can be a prostitute as long as you have faith, right? No, it means your faith can change your life. And the wars in the Old Testament were treated the same way. Those things happen, but we can't just do that because it happened in the past. Early Christians didn't see any conflict with the warlike habits of these great men of old and their own peaceful principles. You know, Hebrews 11, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets, who by means of faith subdued kingdoms, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, routed foreign armies. Man, it's a great story. God did amazing things through them. But that doesn't mean that's how we live. That doesn't mean we have permission to do those same things. We have a new covenant. And a lot of Christians saw those old wars and things as symbols, foreshadowing Christ and the cross. But as time went by, people started to question those simple beliefs, right? In the 2nd century, we have a guy named Marcion. He talked about the just God of the Jews. That God in the Old Testament. He's not our God. Not to Marcion, right? To him, he got rid of a lot of the New Testament. Right? Just kept the works of Paul. Get rid of that Jewish stuff. That's a different God. We don't want that. We got a God of love. They had a God of war, right? But, you know, he split it into two different gods. And so the church is trying to fight it, say, no. There's not two gods. The God of the New Testament, the God of Jesus, the Father, he's the same God in the Old Testament, right? And so if you're trying to reconnect those two and prove that they're really the same God, well, then you got to start applying the warlike characteristics of God in the Old Testament to the New, right? Maybe. A little bit. He's the same God, right? He let him do it then. He's still going to bring judgment and do all these things. And so that kind of puts the peacefulness of the gospel in danger if you're not careful about how you phrase it, right? Because it is true, he is the same God. But again, it's a different covenant. So Tertullian and others in the 3rd century show that Christians were using the Old Testament to justify bearing arms. Now Tertullian is against it, but he's giving some examples of what people tried to say, right? And some of their arguments were not so intelligent, right? Of course, you've got a lot of people who are going to appeal to Joshua. They're going to appeal to the Israelites, right? But some people were saying, look, Moses had a rod. He had a staff, right? So I can have a staff to hit somebody with. Aaron, he wore a buckle. He had a belt. Like you could wear a sword on that, right? John the Baptist, he wore a leather belt. So soldiers wear leather belts. Does that make any sense to you? That because John the Baptist wore a leather belt, I can be a soldier because they have leather belts? That's the arguments people were reducing to because they couldn't find anything better to say, right? Others were justifying going to the public shows, right? Right? Oh, let's go to the show. You know, David, he danced before the ark. Right? Elijah, he rode in a chariot, so let's go to the chariot races. This will be great. Right? No. We're not going to the games, celebrating all these gods and doing all this stuff. We're not going to go to these plays, all these things that are against everything good just because David danced that one time. Right? That doesn't make any sense. But, sadly, once Christian participation in warfare became a problem, Once we've got Christians in the army, thinking it's okay to serve in the army, it's okay to do these things, it gets a lot harder to get them out, right? You start thinking about the wars in the Old Testament, that justifies it, right? They said, look, no, there were war in the Old Testament, I'm going to be in war now, right? So then from that point on, you're going to have people that don't agree, right? The church becomes divided at that point because some people aren't going to be convinced. And so you get this growing voice of this is the way it should be. But yet many, like Origen, considered the Old Testament wars really more like parables or allegories trying to describe some spiritual life. Now, I don't agree with Origen on that. I think they're actually wars, right? But we can learn some lessons from it. But on the whole, all the Orthodox Christians considered those wars of the Old Testament to be the will of God. But they said the will of God for the ancient Hebrews and the will of God for us are different, right? And so we're going to follow the teachings of Jesus. That's it for our lesson tonight.